When we speak about love, we often imagine beauty, warmth, and connection, but rarely do we pause to confront the quiet ways we sabotage the very relationships we long to pursue. Many of us enter love carrying wounds we've never acknowledged, expectations we've never questioned, and attachments we've never purified. And so the mistakes begin long before the relationship does. One of the greatest mistakes is seeking from another human what only the Creator can give: security, worth, validation, or wholeness. When we place divine weight on human shoulders, the collapse is inevitable. Another mistake is loving without boundary, forgetting that healthy love requires self-awareness, responsibility, and clarity, not just emotion. We lose ourselves trying to hold someone else, forgetting that real love does not require self-erasure. Many relationships break because people communicate from fear instead of vulnerability, from ego instead of sincerity, from wounds instead of wisdom. And so the journey toward healthier relationships begins not with the other person, but within ourselves. It begins with healing, with grounding in purpose, and with remembering that love is not meant to consume us, but to elevate us. When love is anchored in sincerity, honesty, and spiritual clarity, it becomes a means of growth, not destruction. Seeking from people what only the Creator can provide is one of the deepest and most common mistakes we make in romantic relationships, and yet it is the one we rarely recognize. From childhood, many of us are taught, directly or indirectly, that another person will one day complete us, rescue us, or fill the emptiness inside us. We grow up believing that love is a destination where all our wounds will finally stop hurting, where loneliness, and where our hearts will remain safe and unbroken. And so we step into relationships with an invisible weight of expectations. Expectations no human being was ever created. We ask them to heal what they did not wound, to calm storms they did not create, and to fill voids they can never reach. And when they fail, not because they are unworthy, but simply because they are human, we break, we resent, or we cling even tighter, desperately trying to squeeze divine fulfillment out of human hands. This cycle repeats because the heart is deeper than emotion. It is spiritual. It was designed with a longing that has only one true source of fulfillment. When we seek that fulfillment from a human being, the relationship becomes strained under pressure, as if we're trying to draw water from a well that was never meant to hold that much. The person becomes either our savior or our disappointment, never simply a companion. We hold our breath waiting for their attention, their approval, or their affection, hoping it will convince us of our worth. And yet, the moment they look away, become distant, or fail to understand us, the fragile sense of security we built around them collapses again. It is not because they don't love us. It is because we built something eternal on something temporary. When a person becomes the center of our emotional universe, we begin to orbit around their moods, their opinions, and their actions. We lose balance. We lose clarity. We lose ourselves. Our happiness rises and falls with their validation, and our peace becomes dependent on circumstances we cannot control. This is not love. It is attachment rooted in fear, scarcity, and insecurity. And it drains both people. The one who is idealized feels suffocated by the pressure to constantly reassure, constantly perform, constantly hold together the emotional world of another. And the one who is dependent becomes increasingly anxious, sensitive to every change, desperate for consistency, and terrified of loss. But the reality is that human beings are not designed to be perfect or permanent sources of emotional oxygen. They are meant to love, to support, to walk beside us, not to replace the deeper anchor our hearts were created to rely on. When we shift this reliance back to its proper place, something powerful happens. The relationship becomes lighter. We no longer demand from our partner what they cannot do. We no longer panic when they falter or fear their imperfections. Instead, we allow them to be human, And we allow ourselves to be whole even when they are not able to meet every need we carry. This spiritual grounding does not diminish human love, it elevates it. When the heart is grounded in its creator, it approaches relationships from a place of fullness, not desperation. Love becomes something we giveth, not something we use to fill a void. We communicate with honesty rather than fear. We set boundaries without guilt. We choose with clarity instead of clinging from insecurity, and we stop confusing attachment with devotion. A relationship built on this foundation becomes a place of growth, not dependency, a place of compassion, not pressure, a place of stability, not emotional volatility. Ultimately, seeking divine fulfillment from human beings is like looking for sunlight in a candle. The candle may warm you, comfort, and give you moments of beauty, but it can never replace the source of real light. When you allow the Creator to fill your emptiness, to define your worth, and to steady your heart, you free the people you love from carrying burdens that aren't theirs. And in doing so, you open the door to a healthier, truer, more peaceful kind of love, one that nourishes rather than drains, strengthens rather than weakens, and guides you toward growth instead of heartbreak. Loving without boundaries and losing yourself in the process is a silent tragedy many people don't recognize until they are already deeply entangled in it. It often begins with the purest intentions, wanting to give wholeheartedly, wanting to be present, wanting to love with sincerity and sacrifice. But slowly, without noticing, the line between love and self-abandonment fades. You begin compromising parts of yourself, not out of a healthy flexibility, but out of fear of losing the person, fear of disappointing them, fear of being seen as too much or not enough. And so, little by little, you shrink to fit into the spaces they leave for you. You silence your needs, your opinions, your dreams, and even your pain, believing that this is what love demands. But love that requires you to disappear is not love. It is self-erasure disguised as devotion. This pattern becomes even more dangerous because it often feels noble. You tell yourself you're being patient, understanding, and loyal. You convince yourself that giving more will eventually bring peace or balance, as if your worthiness must be earned through exhaustion. But the more you give without boundaries, the more the relationship begins to tilt. What was once a partnership turns into an emotional imbalance where one person's needs dominate while the other quietly drowns beneath the weight of trying to hold everything together. You start living in reaction to the other person rather than in alignment with your own values. Their moods dictate your emotions. Their approval becomes your validation. Their neglect becomes your self-blame. And in this process, you slowly lose the essence of who you are. Losing yourself in love is not always dramatic. It can be incredibly subtle. It's the way you stop expressing what hurts you because you don't want to upset them. It's the way you change your personality to match what you think they'll like. It's the way you give excuses for behavior that fractures your peace. It's staying silent when you want to speak, staying present when you need space, or staying attached when your heart is asking you to let go. Over time, this internal suppression builds resentment, confusion, and emotional fatigue. You wake up one day realizing you no longer recognize the person you've become. You've molded yourself into someone who exists primarily to maintain the relationship, while your true self sits forgotten in a corner of your heart. Healthy love is not meant to consume you. It is meant to guide you toward growth. Boundaries are not walls that keep love out. They are the structure that allows love to thrive without suffocating the people within it. When you set boundaries, you are not rejecting the other person. You are honoring yourself. You are saying, I can love you without abandoning me. This is not selfishness. It is emotional clarity. Without boundaries, love becomes chaotic, overwhelming, and draining. It becomes a cycle where you keep giving to prove your value, while the other person becomes accustomed to receiving without reciprocation. And when the balance breaks, the relationship becomes fragile, fluctuating between hope and heartbreak. In truth, boundaries are a form of spiritual protection. They remind you that your heart has dignity, your soul has purpose, and your existence is not defined by how much you can endure. Boundaries help you love with intention rather than desperation. They allow you to stay open without becoming emptied, to care deeply without collapsing under the weight of someone else. When you love with boundaries, you create space for mutual respect, emotional safety, and genuine connection. You no longer rely on self-sacrifice as a currency for affection. Instead, you show up as a whole person. Someone who can love with strength, not fear, with clarity, not confusion. Losing yourself in love is a sign that you have forgotten your own worth. But remembering that worth is the first step toward healing. You learn to speak your truth gently but firmly, to honor your limits without guilt, and to show up in relationships as someone who values their soul as much as their love. And in doing so, you discover that real love does not ask you to disappear. Real love holds space for who you truly are. It does not require you to dim your light, mute your voice, or sacrifice your identity. Instead, it allows you to grow toward yourself, toward the other person, and toward a deeper, healthier, more grounded kind of love that frees rather than confines, nourishes rather than drains, and honors rather than diminishes. Communicating from ego, fear, or unhealed wounds is one of the most painful and destructive patterns that quietly undermines romantic relationships. It happens when we speak not from clarity, compassion, or truth, but from the parts of ourselves that are still hurting, threatened, or defensive. Instead of expressing what we genuinely feel or need, we express what our wounds demand. And wounds speak loudly. They speak through anger when we're really afraid. They speak through silence when we are overwhelmed. They speak through blame when we are itching for reassurance. They speak through control when we are terrified of abandonment. Most of us don't realize that our communication is shaped far more by our past than our present, far more by our fears than our intentions. And so we end up harming the very relationships we long to protect. When ego becomes the filter of our communication, we prioritize being right over being connected. Ego makes us defensive, unable to admit mistakes, unwilling to soften. It convinces us that vulnerability is weakness, and that lowering our guard means losing power. So we argue not to understand, but to win. We listen not to hear, but to prepare our next response. Ego closes the heart while pretending to protect it. But in reality, it builds walls where bridges should be. Many relationships fall apart not because love is absent, but because ego refuses to let the heart speak. Ego makes us prideful, reactive, dismissive, and emotionally distant. It creates a version of us that is so focused on protecting the self that it forgets how to nurture the relationship. Fear, on the other hand, distorts communication in a different but equally damaging way. When fear speaks, everything sounds like danger. A simple pause in a conversation feels like rejection. A misunderstood word feels like betrayal. A moment of silence feels like abandonment. Fear magnifies everything and interprets even neutral moments through a lens of insecurity. Instead of saying, I feel anxious because I care, fear pushes us to say, why don't you love me? Or, you always disappoint me. Fear doesn't know how to ask gently for reassurance. It only knows how to plead or accuse. This leads to overthinking, overreacting, and emotional volatility. The relationship becomes tense, not because anything is necessarily wrong, but because fear keeps predicting loss even where love exists. Unhealed wounds, perhaps the deepest influence of all, shape our communication without us even realizing it. These wounds come from past relationships, childhood experiences, betrayals, neglect, or unresolved pain. They create emotional triggers that explode in moments that seem small on the surface. A tone of voice reminds you of someone who hurt you. A delayed reply reminds you of someone who abandoned you. A disagreement reminds you of a fight that broke you. You're no longer reacting to the present moment. You're reacting to an entire history you never healed from. And your partner feels punished for wounds they didn't cause. When unhealed wounds speak, they speak in patterns shutting down, lashing out, withdrawing, over-pleasing, or becoming overly suspicious. They create cycles where communication becomes a battlefield instead of a bridge. The tragedy is not that we have wounds. Everyone does. The tragedy is that we often refuse to acknowledge them, and so they control us from the shadows. Healing requires honesty, humility, and courage. It requires us to look inward before looking outward, to soften before reacting, to pause before speaking. When communication shifts from ego to sincerity, from fear to clarity, from wounds to awareness, the entire relationship transforms. Instead of assuming the worst, we ask for understanding. Instead of shutting down, we open gently. Instead of accusing, we express our vulnerability. Instead of reacting, we reflect. And in doing so, we create space for real intimacy. Intimacy that is built not on perfection, but on emotional honesty. Healthy communication is not about never getting hurt. It's about knowing how to handle the pain without destroying the connection. It's about speaking from your heart instead of your hurt. It's about remembering that your partner is not your enemy and that your wounds are calling for healing, not conflict. When we learn to communicate from a place of emotional responsibility and spiritual grounding, we stop hurting the person who loves us and start healing the parts of ourselves that love itself has been waiting to renew. This is how relationships deepen, strengthen, and transform through communication that is conscious, compassionate, and rooted in truth rather than fear. Entering relationships without emotional self-awareness is one of the quietest but most powerful reasons so many people find themselves in cycles of conflict, disappointment, and heartbreak. Emotional self-awareness is the ability to understand your own feelings, where they come from, how they affect you, and how they influence the way you relate to others. Without this inner clarity, you don't enter a relationship as a whole. Conscious, grounded person, you enter as a bundle of reactions, assumptions, and unexamined emotions. And those emotions often steer your behavior far more than your intentions do. Many people step into love hoping it will heal their insecurities, erase their loneliness, or distract them from unresolved pain. But without understanding the emotional patterns that shape us internally, we end up building a relationship on foundations we don't even realize are shaky. When you lack emotional self-awareness, you often don't know what you truly need, but you desperately expect someone else to provide it. You don't know what triggers you, but you react intensely when those triggers are touched. You don't understand your fears, but you project them onto the other person. You can't recognize your unhealed wounds, so you interpret everything through the lens of past hurt. This creates confusion. Not only for you, but for the person trying to love you. You may feel neglected when you actually need reassurance. You may feel angry when you're really overwhelmed. You may feel abandoned when the other person simply needs space. Emotional self-awareness is the difference between reacting blindly and responding with understanding. Without it, relationships become emotional storms, unpredictable, exhausting, and easily shaken. Another painful consequence of lacking emotional self-awareness is that you might choose relationships from a place of emptiness rather than purpose. Many people enter relationships seeking validation, security, or identity. They choose partners who mirror their wounds rather than their values, who fill a temporary void rather than support long-term growth. You may find yourself attracted to people who repeat the dynamics of your past, not because they are healthy, but because they feel familiar. Without self-awareness, familiarity feels like love. even when it's actually a repeated cycle of pain. You keep choosing what feels emotionally recognizable, not realizing that what feels familiar is often what once hurt you. Emotional self-awareness also affects how you communicate. When you don't understand your own emotions, everything becomes external. You make me angry. You make me insecure. You make me feel unwanted. But often, the emotion existed long before the relationship. The other person simply activated it. When we fail to recognize this, we place an unfair burden on our partner to fix emotions that originated within us. The relationship becomes a place where the other person must constantly soothe, reassure, and justify themselves. Not because they are doing something wrong, but because you have not fully met yourself. Over time, this creates emotional exhaustion for both people. One feels drained by giving constant reassurance. The other feels frustrated because their needs never feel fully met. But the real issue has nothing to do with the partner's effort. It has everything to do with the lack of internal clarity. Without emotional self-awareness, boundaries also become nearly impossible to maintain. You either set no boundaries at all, letting the relationship consume you, or you set rigid, defensive boundaries that push the other person away. Both extremes come from not knowing yourself deeply. When you are disconnected from your emotional world, you cannot discern when to say yes, when to say no, when to speak up, or when to step back. You may tolerate what hurts you or reject what could heal. You may cling too tightly or detach too quickly. Everything becomes a reaction instead of a conscious choice. But emotional self-awareness is not about being perfect. It is about being honest. It is the willingness to sit with your own heart, to ask yourself difficult questions, to acknowledge your fears, insecurities, and desires without judgment. It is learning to recognize this isn't about them. This is about something inside me. When you cultivate this awareness, you bring more clarity, steadiness, and compassion into the relationship. You communicate more gently because you're no longer speaking from confusion. You choose more wisely because you understand your motivations. You love more responsibly because you are aware of the emotional world you're bringing into the connection. A relationship entered without self-awareness becomes a place where two unconscious wounds collide. But a relationship entered with self-awareness becomes a place where two conscious souls meet. When you know yourself, your triggers, your needs, your patterns, your strengths, your weaknesses, you are no longer looking for someone to complete you. You are choosing someone to grow with. And that shift alone transforms the entire relationship from a place of emotional confusion to one of emotional clarity, intention, and depth. Expecting perfection instead of accepting human limitation is one of the most subtle yet destructive forces in romantic relationships. It often begins without intention. An unspoken belief that the person we love should meet all our needs, understand all our emotions, anticipate our desires, and never disappoint or fail us. We imagine that true love means harmony without conflict, support without pause, and connection without misunderstanding. But this expectation of perfection is not only unrealistic, it is deeply unfair. It turns the relationship into a test the other person is destined to fail. And when they do fail, not because they don't love us, but because they are human, we interpret their imperfection as evidence of a lack of love, loyalty, or effort. Perfectionism in relationships often stems from fear, the fear of being hurt, the fear of vulnerability, the fear of losing what we cherish. When we fear these things, we unconsciously try to control the relationship by expecting flawless behavior. We create rules and expectations that no human being could ever fully meet. The smallest mistake becomes exaggerated. The slightest flaw becomes magnified. We become hypersensitive to every disappointment, interpreting it as personal rather than human. The truth is, the more we expect perfection, the less space we leave for sincerity. We forget that love is not found in flawless moments. It is found in how people show up repeatedly despite their flaws. Loving someone means embracing their humanity, not idealizing their image. It means understanding that the person you love will sometimes misunderstand you, sometimes hurt you unintentionally, sometimes fall short, and sometimes struggle with their own wounds, emotions, and limitations. If we cannot accept these things, we are not loving them. We are loving a version of them that exists only in our imagination. And that kind of love is fragile. It collapses the moment reality appears. A relationship rooted in unrealistic expectations becomes suffocating because the other person constantly feels judged, monitored, or afraid of disappointing you. Instead of being able to love freely, they begin to walk on emotional eggshells, terrified that one mistake will shatter everything. Expecting perfection also blinds us to our own imperfections. It creates a double standard where we demand grace but do not give it, where we expect patience but offer criticisms, where we desire understanding but resist giving the same. Relationships thrive when humility replaces self, but when perfectionism takes over, every argument becomes a scorecard, every disagreement becomes a threat, and every flaw becomes a flaw in the relationship itself. We forget that growth is a process, not an instant tremendous. We forget that the person we love is evolving just as we are. Expecting perfection denies them the space to be human and denies us the opportunity to grow together. Perfectionism also distorts the way we interpret conflict. Instead of seeing disagreements as natural, we see them as signs of incompatibility. Instead of viewing emotional needs as normal, we see them as burdens. Instead of understanding our partner's struggle, we see their humanity as an inconvenience. But the beauty of a relationship is not in never having conflict. It is in learning how to navigate conflict with compassion, patience, and honesty. It is in choosing forgiveness over pride, understanding over assumption, and empathy over judgment. When we accept human limitations, arguments no longer feel like failures. They become opportunities to deepen trust and strengthen connection. Accepting human limitation does not mean lowering standards or tolerating harmful behavior. It means recognizing the difference between genuine shortcomings and intentional harm. It means giving grace for human errors while maintaining boundaries for destructive patterns. It means understanding that love asks for effort, not perfection. When you accept your partner's humanity, you create a safe space for vulnerability, where both people can express their fears, struggles, and imperfections without fear of rejection. This kind of acceptance is what deepens intimacy. It allows both hearts to rest instead of perform, to breathe instead of prove, to grow instead of hide. The truth is, perfection is not what makes love strong. What makes love strong is the ability to stay when things get imperfect, the patience to work through struggles, and the softness to forgive. What makes love real is acknowledging that two imperfect people are trying every day to choose each other despite their flaws. When we stop expecting perfection, we begin to truly appreciate the small efforts, the apologies, the attempts, the growth, the moments of sincerity that might otherwise go unnoticed. We start seeing the person in front of us instead of the fantasy in our mind. To love someone fully is to embrace their humanity, to recognize that imperfection is not a threat but an invitation, to grow, to understand, to deepen the connection. When you let go of the need for perfection, you make room for something much more beautiful: compassion, authenticity, and a love that can withstand the inevitable imperfections of life. Forgetting that healthy love requires balance, purpose, and spiritual grounding is one of the most profound reasons relationships lose direction, collapse under pressure, or drift into emotional exhaustion. Many people enter relationships with sincere intentions, but sincerity alone is not enough to sustain love. Love is not just a feeling, it is a structure. It is something that needs balance to stay upright, purpose to stay meaningful, and spiritual grounding to stay stable. When any of these elements is missing, the relationship becomes vulnerable to confusion, insecurity, and emotional imbalance. Balance is essential because love becomes unhealthy the moment it tilts too far in one direction. When one person gives too much while the other gives too little, when one sacrifices everything while the other sacrifices nothing, when one person's needs dominate while the others remain hidden. Without balance, love becomes a burden rather than a blessing. It becomes a place where one heart grows weary under the weight of carrying everything alone. Balance means that both people take responsibility for nurturing the relationship, communicating honestly, and showing up with consistency. It means recognizing that love is not meant to drain you, it is meant to support you. But when we forget this, we glorify overgiving, mistake exhaustion for loyalty, and assume that losing ourselves is a sign of devotion. In reality, imbalance suffocates. It turns affection into obligation and connection into dependency. True love requires equilibrium, where both hearts are nourished, not depleted. Purpose is equally important because without purpose, love becomes directionless. When a relationship lacks purpose, it becomes an emotional loop, repeating the same arguments, the same misunderstandings, the same cycles of closeness and distance. Purpose gives love a destination. It gives clarity to decisions, meaning to sacrifice, and strength during difficult moments. Purpose is the understanding that love is not just about companionship. It is about growth. It is about helping each other become better, healthier, wiser, more compassionate human beings. When we forget purpose, we start treating the relationship like a temporary emotional refuge instead of a journey towards something greater. We begin to seek comfort without accountability, closeness without responsibility, and affection without maturity. But purpose holds the relationship to a higher standard. It asks, how are we growing? How are we supporting each other's values? How are we becoming more grounded, more patient, more sincere? Without these questions, love becomes sentimental but shallow, full of emotion but lacking direction. Spiritual grounding is what gives love depth and meaning beyond the surface. Without spiritual grounding, relationships become vulnerable to ego, fear, jealousy, insecurity, and fleeting emotions. When love is spiritually grounded, it is not built on temporary feelings. It is built on a foundation that does not shake when moods shift or challenges arise. Spiritual grounding reminds you that your partner is not your source of worth, identity, or inner peace. They are a companion, not a replacement for the divine. When we forget this, we place unrealistic expectations on them. We depend on them to cure our sadness, fix our insecurities, or fill our emptiness. But no human being can do that. Without spiritual grounding, love becomes a form of emotional worship, where one person becomes the center of your life and the relationship becomes the measure of your worth. This kind of attachment is fragile. It breaks the moment the other person disappoints you, becomes busy, or shows their humanity. Spiritually grounded love, on the other hand, is steadier. It allows you to love deeply without becoming dependent, to give generously without draining yourself, and to forgive sincerely without tolerating harm. It helps you see your partner with compassion, recognizing their flaws without idealizing or demonizing them. It helps you handle conflict with patience, knowing that growth often requires discomfort. It helps you remain centered even when the relationship goes through challenges, because your core is anchored in something greater than the relationship itself. Balance keeps the relationship healthy. Purpose keeps it meaningful. Spiritual grounding keeps it stable. When these elements work together, love becomes something transformative, something that builds rather than breaks, uplifts rather than consumes, nourishes rather than empties. But when we forget them, we confuse attachment with love, intensity with connection, and emotional highs with genuine, We end up chasing relationships that drain us, patterns that repeat, and emotions that overwhelm. Healthy love is not accidental. It is intentional. It is built with awareness, nurtured with purpose, and sustained with spiritual grounding. When you remember this, you no longer chase love out of desperation. You cultivate it with wisdom. You love without losing yourself. You connect without clinging. You grow without forcing. And you begin to experience a kind of love that strengthens your heart, aligns with your purpose, and anchors your soul. Love that is balanced, meaningful, and deeply grounded.